Harris has an economic plan that's going to help lower the cost for everyday people, that's going to help families thrive.
Only candidate who will be on the stage tomorrow night that has shown how you rebuild an economy, Donald Trump. It's a pretty easy choice.
Trump's the reason we're in this mess to begin with. Yes? He is the one who took down Roe and unleashed all of this chaos and all of this cruelty.
Hello, everyone. I'm Major Garrett in Washington. Welcome to America Decides. Vice President Kamala Harris and former President Trump are quite expectedly gearing up for their presidential debate. Just as you would imagine they would. The candidates will face off for the first time tomorrow night. That's in Philadelphia. Both are taking slightly different approaches in their preparation. Harris has been practicing with campaign advisors standing in for Trump, while Trump has had not very many of these mock debates, but has been brushing up, staffers say, on his various policies. Election Day is just 57 days away. Tomorrow night's debate could, of course, prove pivotal. Our CBS News Battleground Tracker poll shows a very tight race in three important states: Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. Our Caitlin Huey-Burns and Ed O'Keefe are standing by with more on the debate, but we will start with Anthony Salvanto and the latest CBS News polling. Anthony, what can you tell us?
Hey there, Major. Good to talk to you. Look, this is the definition of tight, right? Even in Pennsylvania, where the debate's taking place, effectively even Michigan, Wisconsin. I want to show you one reason why within the framework of the economy, and it's this. People say that their incomes aren't keeping up with inflation. When people say that inflation is a major factor in their vote, we find Donald Trump winning the lion's share of those voters. Okay, that's advantage Trump. But that's a little bit retrospective, right? Sort of punishing the party in power if you don't think the economy is doing well. But then when I ask people, okay, whose policies or would their policies help the middle class, you get a much more even breakdown. You get slight majorities in all these states saying they think Harris's policies will. You get about half saying Trump's will, but a little bit of an advantage there for Harris. So framing how they approach the economy, that's one way you sort of do a viewer's guide to what you're going to see tomorrow night, Major.
And Anthony, what can you tell us about the various groups that show up in our surveys and how they are supporting either Harris or Trump, or how there has been any movement in those groups recently?
Sure. Well, one thing you want to look at, I think, is the gender gap. And we're going to keep coming back to this because we've seen it in these states and nationwide. This is an example from Pennsylvania. Harris doing better with women. Some of that is about the abortion issue. Not all of it, though. But that's one thing to track, and that's one big group to look at. The other in these states, really important, are union households, working class voters. And look how tight all of that is. Both of them, obviously, have been fighting for union endorsements, talking about working class voters. That's all really tight as well. So that's a couple of the key groups. You know, white non-college voters make up almost half the voters in these states. And that's another critical group we're going to look at. And that's another critical group that I think you're going to have to see. They're breaking towards Donald Trump, but can Harris cut in to some of those numbers, Major?
Anthony, it is assumed in the Trump world that when former President Trump posts on his social media platform, he is talking only to his base, and nobody else in America really pays much attention to those remarks, no matter how incendiary or ranting they may sound. What do we know about the effect, if any, of his social media posts on the electorate?
Oh, people pay attention. They don't necessarily weigh that against their vote, though, by which I mean this. We find 7 in 10, and this is an example from Wisconsin, it's in all the states, who don't like those posts. In fact, they say that they're trying to be insulting toward Kamala Harris. But just the same, a quarter of those voters are voting for Donald Trump nonetheless. And many of his supporters don't think they're insulting. They like them. Same is in the eye of the beholder, Major. There's a lot of Trump voters who feel that the messages coming out of the Harris campaign, they also consider insulting. Yes, they tell us in this poll that they'd like to hear positive messages, that they'd like to hear good things from both candidates. It's politics, and so they may not get what they want, but that's how they feel, Major.
Anthony Salvanto, always a pleasure. Thank you very much. Caitlin Huey-Burns and Ed O'Keefe join me now. Want to bring in you both. Ed, let me start with you at the White House. From the Harris campaign's perspective, how important is tomorrow evening's debate?
Oh, it's crucial, Major. I think they see some of the surveys released by us and others over the weekend that continue to show there are gaps to fill in regarding who she is, what she's about, what she would do. And in the conversations I've had with Democrats today, across the spectrum, across the country, they've said she's really got to set up a contrast and give a sense of what she would do going forward, spend less time going back. If she can stoke him into personal attacks on her or grievances that he likes to air every so often, that's a net positive for them, because it will remind those handful of undecided voters in these 7 states or so what he's been about and what he could continue to be about for the next 4 years. And if she's got some kind of a positive looking ahead message, that helps. It also is sort of the one and only chance they have to contrast side by side with him. They've never met before. She's been in the House chamber when he gave the State of the Union. That's about it. But they've never been face to face. She's never faced an adversary quite like this. She's a good debater since she was a DA, an AG, and a Senate candidate. She can take on competition, but never quite someone like Trump. And so that's what these last few days of intense preparation out in Pittsburgh have been all about.
Ed, before I go to Caitlin, I want to ask you also about what difference, if any, has it made in these preparations for the vice president that it has been determined that the mics, more often than not, will be muted in these exchanges?
Look, they're trying to cast this as a real disadvantage for them, and I think that's partly designed to lower expectations so that if she can find a way, she looks even more masterful at this. The reason they're frustrated by it is, remember, some of her best moments have come when putting men in their place, whether it was telling Mike Pence to stop interrupting her, whether it was sharply questioning Brett Kavanaugh or Neil Gorsuch back in the day during Supreme Court confirmation hearings. And so if the mics are off and she can't provoke him while she's got hers on, or vice versa, their concern is it's going to be harder for her to create a moment or two that ends up in your Instagram feed the next day, that ends up in an ad, that ends up in our recaps of it on the CBS mornings the next day. Whether she can do it some other way, I'm sure they've worked on that, and I'm sure they were working on that ahead of this. But they're trying to sort of just put that out there and say, oh, gosh, if only the mics hadn't been muted, maybe we'd have a better shot at this. Still, undoubtedly, they've been working on it, despite what they might suggest.
Ed O'Keefe, please stand by. Caitlin Huey-Burns is in Philadelphia. Caitlin, talk to us about the Trump preparation.
Well, the Trump campaign likes to kind of pride itself on the idea that they say that Trump doesn't need the kind of preparations and doesn't do the kind of preparations that Kamala Harris or his previous opponent, Joe Biden, did. They argue that he's doing interviews with media, that he's out there talking in rallies off the cuff on the campaign trail. And of course, you can argue whether that does accrue to his benefit when you look at the polling. But they kind of pride themselves on that. He has a more informal approach to that, and it could have worked to his advantage in that first debate. He essentially knocked out his opponent during the race. This, however, is a completely different set of circumstances. Namely, he is now running against a woman, and the campaign has been asked, how that changes their approach. And Tulsi Gabbard, the former congresswoman, former Democratic congresswoman, who's now advising Trump and helping with the preparations, said today that to kind of battle that, or to kind of confront that, they are going to argue what Trump's policies do for women compared to the current status quo. But it's also interesting, Major, a senior advisor to the campaign, Jason Miller, told reporters today that it is impossible to prepare for a debate against Donald Trump in their view, because he said that going against Donald Trump, preparing to go against Donald Trump, is akin to preparing to go against Muhammad Ali or Floyd Mayweather. Insofar as you don't know what angle he's going to come at you with, you don't know how he's going to come at you. I don't know a lot about boxing, admittedly, but in my view, that is setting pretty high expectations for this kind of performance to make that kind of comparison. So as much as they argue that this is a moment that they believe all the stakes are high for Kamala Harris, they're setting some pretty high expectations for themselves as well today.
Yeah, they're setting high expectations, and yet the former president is on record saying that the vice president is incompetent, can't put two sentences together, is unintelligent. I mean, how do you square those two kinds of orientations?
Yeah, that's exactly right, Major. And what they are trying to do, what the campaign says, their goal for success, how they would define success tomorrow night, is if the former president can attach Biden and all of the baggage of this administration, in their view, to Kamala Harris, because that's what they've been trying to do over the past 6 weeks or so. Essentially say she is a stand-in for Biden and attach all of his policies and all of his perceived failures to her. And in polling, you haven't necessarily seen that yet, although the race has certainly tightened, as you mentioned, in those key battlegrounds. So that is how they are defining success for their campaign for tomorrow.
Joining us from the city of brotherly love, Caitlin Huey-Burns, and from the North Lawn of the White House, Ed O'Keefe. Thank you very much. Here's something you will be very interested to know. We will have special editions of America Decides tomorrow from the Debate Spin Room in Philadelphia at 5 p.m. and 7 p.m. Eastern. The debate itself, hosted, we should note, by ABC News, can be watched right here on CBS News 24/7 starting at 9 p.m. Eastern. Vice President Harris is in Pittsburgh ahead of tomorrow's debate. We'll speak with a senior campaign advisor about Harris's preparations. You're streaming America Decides. Welcome back to America Decides. We're just one day away from Kamala Harris and Donald Trump's big showdown in Philadelphia. Michael Tyler is here to further discuss that. He is the Harris-Walz campaign's communications director and joins us from Wilmington, Delaware. Michael, always good to see you. It was said at the Democratic Convention in Chicago, I know you remember, by many prominent Democrats, there will be bad polls, the race will tighten, don't lose focus, don't lose heart. How are you digesting this weekend's polling data?
Yeah, well, thank you, Major, for having me. Listen, I think what the polling data shows is what we know to be true. This is going to be a very, very close and competitive presidential campaign. It's going to come down to tens of thousands of votes in a handful of states. And so that's why nights like tomorrow night matter. But frankly, what matters even more is the work that this campaign is going to do coming off of the debate on Tuesday night, when we're hitting the road and campaigning across every single battleground state. We're going to hit every media market in every battleground state to between Thursday and Sunday of this week, because we have to leave no stone untouched over the course of the last 2 months of this campaign. One campaign is putting in the work to do that. The vice president is doing so. Donald Trump, it remains to be seen the degree to which they're going to put in the effort to actually get the job done. But we know between now and November, we're going to do everything at our disposal to reach every single voter that is going to help us decide the pathway to 270 electoral votes. Who is the favorite and who is the underdog tomorrow night? Well, listen, I think the vice president has made very clear that she sees herself as the underdog in this race, right? You're running against a former president. You're running against somebody who, as it relates to tomorrow night, has obviously, this will be his 7th presidential general election debate. The vice president debated last in 2020 against Mike Pence. He's also a showman who's going to be somewhat restrained by the muted microphones, given the fact that his team decided to overrule his decision here. But at the end of the day, the vice president is going to be ready to present her vision for where she wants to take this country and contrast that against whatever version of Donald Trump shows up. No matter what his behavior is like, I think you're going to see him and his Extreme Project 2025 agenda on full display, not just tomorrow night, but for the remainder of this campaign. And so the vice president sees this as an opportunity to continue to introduce herself to the American people, to continue to demonstrate what her vision is going to be for the next 4 years, and to make sure that the electorate understands the fundamental choice in this election. After the first debate, which involved President Biden and former President Trump, the vice president was interviewed and said that the former president lied many times during that debate. Is she going to fact check relentlessly, point by point, the former president if that happens again? Well, listen, I'm not going to get into too many of the previews of the debate strategy here, but I think it should come as no surprise to the American people that Donald Trump will, in fact, get up on that debate stage and lie for the entirety of it. That's what you see out of Donald Trump every single day. And so that's why, the vice president, of course, will make sure that people understand what the truth is. But this campaign will make sure that people understand exactly the threat that Donald Trump poses to the American people on every single issue. No matter what he says on abortion, we'll make sure that the American people understand that if he's able to regain power, he does plan to enact a national abortion ban with or without Congress. We'll make sure that the American people understand that if he returns to power, he wants to do nothing more than give more tax cuts to the ultra wealthy and more handouts to corporations. We'll make sure that people understand, as he himself often tweets or puts on Truth Social, as he did over this weekend, that if he's able to regain power, he intends to to jail his political opponents and tear down the Constitution, as he has made clear. So we know the type of person that's going to show up in the debate stage. This campaign is going to remain disciplined and make sure that the people actually understand the true nature of the choice in this election.
Michael, to what degree does the vice president have to convey to the American public strength similar to that of former President Trump?
Well, listen, I think what she has to convey is what she's been doing since July 21st, right? She's speaking to the fundamental choice in this election, and she's speaking to what the American people actually want, right? They're looking for a new way forward, and that's what she has been presenting over the course of the past few weeks. Obviously, you saw it in Chicago during the convention, but you've seen her do this out on the stump, demonstrate how she intends to govern this country if elected. And so we'll certainly do that tomorrow night and contrast that against the sort of dark vision that Donald Trump has, all the work that he wants to do to roll back the progress that we have made, the work that he wants to do to, again, enact a national abortion ban, the chaos that he wants to sow, the division that he wants to sow. I think that stands complete opposite to the way that the vice president wants to govern, right? No matter the issue, whether it's the economy that she wants to build so that people have the opportunity to actually get ahead instead of just get by, whether we're talking about the fundamental rights and freedoms that she's going to stand up for. On every issue, you have a person in the vice president who's actually working to bring people together in search of solutions. And on the other side, you have Donald Trump, who's running a campaign that's based upon personal grievance, that's based upon revenge, that's based upon retribution, and it's based upon service of nobody other than Donald Trump. And so I think the vice president will be successful in demonstrating exactly that contrast, not just tonight, but for the remainder of this campaign.
Michael Tyler, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Coming up, part of my conversation with former White House Communications Director, now Harris endorser, Anthony Scaramucci, on how former President Trump is probably getting ready for tomorrow night's debate. That's next. You're streaming America Decides. Welcome back to America Decides. The 2020 election was maddening for many election officials. Baseless allegations of fraud, harassment, and threats of violence were just some of what they had to endure, and to a certain degree are still enduring. Last week, election officials in 7 battleground states convened in Georgia to compare notes. I sat down with 4 of them to discuss their preparations for November.
In Michigan, for years, as we've gone through this process before, we always say we hope for the best, but plan for every contingency. So that involves a lot of anxiety and a lot of scenario planning and a lot of thinking about the worst that could happen and then making a plan for it.
It's not just Democrats who are concerned. 3 of the election officials that I spoke to are Republicans, and they're worried, but also are confident that they're well prepared.
The biggest thing I worry about is the possibility of violence, again, regardless of outcome, by people who lose.
We're prepared. We know what we've seen in the last 2 cycles. We're sort of ready for anything. But I've got great faith in our team, and I've got great faith in the people of Maricopa County.
You can see more of my conversation with battleground election officials tomorrow night on the CBS Evening News. Anthony Scaramucci is predicting how his former boss, Donald Trump, will approach tomorrow's debate. I spoke with the former White House Communications Director for my podcast, The Takeout. Looking forward to this first and possibly only presidential debate between Kamala Harris and former President Trump. Do you consider it, from now until Election Day, the most important event?
So I think if it's a neutral outcome, then I don't think it's the most important event. But I think if somebody damages themselves or somebody outshines the other, then it becomes important. You know, in 2020, Major, Joe Biden bested Donald Trump in the first debate. He was a little wild, probably had COVID at the time, and President Trump dropped 5 points after that debate, and he never regained ground after that. So if something monumental like that happens, yes, then I do think it's an important thing.
What would you say is most on the mind of Trump going into this encounter?
Well, he wants to embarrass her. You know, his whole thing is that he's very thin on policy. You know, some people say that he's an inch deep. You know, he's a very wide lake with an inch deep. I don't see it that way. He's like a contact lens deep. And so he doesn't have a lot of policy chops. So he's going to want to embarrass her. So he's hoping that some ad hominem attacks will unravel her. And he wants to juxtaposition her as unpresidential compared to him. And so some of that is imagery. And so he'll try to bully her at the debate. That's my prediction. It's been successful for him. The playbook has been successful for him, so he's not going to change the playbook now.
You can watch more of my interview with Anthony Scaramucci this Sunday at 10:30 p.m. Eastern right here on CBS News. It's Donald Trump's most blatant sign yet that he may not accept defeat in November. The very controversial social media posts and what they mean if he loses the election. That's next. You're streaming America Decides. Welcome back to America Decides. Former President Trump is making headlines, and that's putting it mildly, that have nothing to do with his plans to make a pitch to the American public in tomorrow night's debate. He's making headlines because he's pledging and has pledged on social media to prosecute political opponents. His threats are related to false claims that the 2020 election was stolen, something he admitted didn't happen even last week. And now some of those threats are saying he's going to punish, prosecute, and jail for long terms anyone involved in the 2024 election if he's unhappy with the result. I want to discuss that with our political panel. Nancy Cook is here, national politics reporter with Bloomberg News, and Dave Weigel with Semaphore. On what planet, Dave, does this make legal, political, or constitutional sense to go down this road for Trump?
Not in any of those categories, and he's gone back and forth on this. I'm not trying to soft pedal it. He's gone back and forth. He's demanded credit for not going after Hillary Clinton for, I don't know, what would have been the case in 2017, right. and he has regretted not going after his political opponents because the way he frames every trial, every investigation, is that they're just trying to take him out. So it makes a lot of sense to Republicans. It's teeing up for tomorrow's debate. It's another example of the universe, the media universe that Donald Trump exists in right now is different than the one he had in 16 and 20. It's one where you say something like this and you get cheered for it. It's not one where you need to make new converts to convince people you're going to behave responsibly with power.
Nancy?
Well, I was in Palm Beach meeting with a bunch of his top campaign officials last month, and they really want him to continue to talk about inflation, the economy, and immigration. That is where polling shows he has a huge advantage with swing state voters, and they really feel like if he sticks with those messages, he'll be successful. But meanwhile, in the past week, we've seen him, talk about jailing his political opponents. He on Saturday talked about imposing 100% tariffs on some countries. He is promoting very extreme policies at a time when the election is so close in all these swing states with Harris. And I think that if he stuck to the issues where he did have the advantage, he would probably be doing potentially much better.
And do statements like this, which Trump makes with frequency, alarm those closest to him in the inner circle, advising him?
I think that the people in the inner circle around him sort of believe what a lot of Trump advisors have long believed, that what he does or what he says, his rhetoric does not always match his action. But that is actually not true. I mean, we saw after he lost the 2020 election, he kept talking about how the election was stolen. Some of his advisors that I talked to when I covered the Trump White House were talking about his second-term agenda. And then we saw January 6th, wherein his followers tried to take back power and stop the certification of the election results. So I think that what we've seen about Trump in the past is that you do have to take these comments that he makes quite seriously.
Dave and Nancy, I want to share with you some very new polling data from CBS News. I want to put this up. This is about the Senate races in the battleground states we reported on yesterday, showing a close race between the vice president and former President Trump. So in order, let's go Michigan, Alyssa Slotkin, 48%. Over Republican nominee Mike Rogers, 41%. We'll go to the next one, which is Pennsylvania. Bob Casey, the incumbent, 48%. Dave McCormick, the Republican nominee, 41%. Again, Democratic incumbent Tammy Baldwin in Wisconsin, 51%. Republican nominee Eric Hovde, 43%. All of these show outside the margin of error leads for the Democrats and running against ahead of Kamala Harris. What does that tell you, Dave?
These are also all opponents that Mitch McConnell likes. I should say Republican nominees that Mitch McConnell likes. These are not candidates who got over the line with the Trump endorsement in a primary and the party's embarrassed by them. They really wanted David McCormick to be the nominee in Pennsylvania. They cleared the field. They really wanted Eric Hovde once it was clear Mike Gallagher was going to run for Senate. They really, it brought in Mike Rogers, who dropped a potential presidential race, which he probably would have lost, to do this. And you're seeing a separation everywhere. Swing states. Let's focus on the ones that have the Senate races. Democrats are doing better with non-white voters and with younger white men than Kamala Harris is, Trump is doing better with those voters than the rest of his ticket. Even I was in North Carolina last week. Even North Carolina, Mark Robinson, African-American lieutenant governor, running for governor, been hit across
the Republican.
as the Republican, hit across the airwaves for controversial things he said on Facebook. He's doing worse to those voters than Donald Trump is. So the party, for all the things Trump is doing that might hurt his campaign a given day, he has this appeal that has not translated down ballot.
Nancy, is this just the power of incumbency, or is there something that these candidates are doing that Harris should pay closer attention to?
Well, Harris should probably pay closer attention to it, but also it's just so striking because it's such a flip from where we were earlier in the summer when, Biden was still on the ticket and, Democrats were largely cautioning the rest of the party. People like former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi were saying, look, if Biden stays on the ticket, we're totally underwater in these Senate races. And so it's remarkable to me that with Harris ascending to the top of the ticket, she doesn't have numbers like they do, but the Senate races are just showing much more promise for the Democrats. And the Senate is really sort of their weakest part of the map. And so I think that is a good sign for them.
And Dave, as you know, Democrats are being bullish about their prospects in the House, relatively bullish about Harris. Do you see a scenario in which if everything breaks Harris's way, they win all three?
They would need to pull out, if not Montana, need to win a surprise in Texas or in Florida. There is no math that gets them the Senate without that. So it's still, you talk to even optimistic Democrats, they're thinking about a House that would follow the Harris agenda, a Senate that would stimmy this or that. There's already some conversation about what you can offer to Lisa Murkowski and Susan Collins, who I think who'd be in cycle in maybe her final term, maybe not. Already getting ready for a world where there'd be some moderate Republicans who might want to move on. Because imagine this world where Kamala Harris defeats Donald Trump. He's dropped 2 in a row. What does somebody like Lisa Murkowski or Susan Collins think now? How much do they want to move on? Are they willing to deal on nominees or on immigration or something?
See, we didn't talk about the debate at all. We talked about other really cool stuff. Dave Weigel and Nancy Cook, thank you so very much. New Hampshire Governor Chris Sununu, Republican up there, being hailed as a hero. Imagine that, after he helped save a choking man at a speed eating competition this past weekend. The governor hosted the Hampton Beach Lobster Roll Eating Contest. Apparently that's a thing up there. When he noticed that a contestant was signaling for help while choking on his food. The governor rushed toward the man, gave him the Heimlich maneuver until first responders took over. As soon as the food was dislodged, this speed eater went right back to the contest. As Governor Sununu put it, quote, he ate another 7 lobster rolls after that, right down the gullet, as if there's any other way. The government shutdown looms as lawmakers return to Capitol Hill. We'll speak with House Majority Whip and Republican Congressman from Minnesota, Tom Emmer, about this funding deadline. That's next. You're streaming America Decides. Welcome back to America Decides. Lawmakers are back on Capitol Hill following a weeks-long summer recess to address yet another fast-approaching government shutdown deadline. Funding for the government runs out on October 1st. That's roughly 3 weeks from today. House Republicans are pushing a continuing resolution that would keep the government funded through March 28th. It is coupled with a House-approved Republican bill that would require Americans to provide proof of citizenship in order to vote in federal elections. The White House has strongly criticized this proposal. House Majority Whip and Minnesota Republican Congressman Tom Emmer joins us now. Tom, it's great to see you. Thanks for being here. So there's a continuing resolution to avoid a government shutdown pending. Will that pass this week in the Republican-controlled House of Representatives?
The Republicans in the House are definitely going to move a stopgap funding bill. We'll whip the current form of it tonight, which is the SAVE Act,
right?
Which requires only American citizens vote in U.S. Federal elections. And then
will you have the votes to pass that iteration of this continuing resolution?
Oh, we may. We're going to be whipping it tonight.
You may not.
We're going to be whipping it tonight. We'll know better where we're at tonight, Major. Not trying to be evasive. The goal is to pass it this week and then move on to what everybody wants to get done before
Yes
October.
or no, will there be a government shutdown?
No, I don't believe there will be.
How does this get resolved?
I think Republicans and Democrats get this thing done before the end of the month.
And that thing that gets done before the end of the month extends spending authority to the end of the year or longer?
Well, you have to have a willing dance partner. And at least under the House proposal, it'll have the SAVE Act in it, and it'll have a 6-month continuing resolution. The Senate, I don't know yet if they're interested in that long of a period.
Sounds like they're not.
But we do hear that they're not interested in the SAVE Act, which is frankly pretty amazing when you consider that 87% of Americans think that it's not a bad idea to have people prove their citizenship in order to register to vote. So it'll be interesting if they say that's actually a poison pill in the deal, Garrett. Major, I do this to you all the time, don't I? Yeah, too many hits to the head. But the literally, if that's their poison pill, what does that tell the American people?
You know as well as I do, Congressman, that the statistical probability or actual presence of undocumented people participating in U.S. elections is extremely small.
Listen, what we have are tens of millions of people coming across our southern border. I don't know what statistics you can look in the rearview mirror and say that all applies to what we're looking at right now. You've had a wide open border under this administration. You've had more than 10 million people come illegally across the border, and it's nice of you to call them undocumented. The fact is they are illegally in this country, and that needs to be dealt with. They should not be participating in elections. My state, you got a governor who voted, who signed a law that allows illegals to get driver's licenses. How do you guarantee that they're not going to use that license and attempt to vote? They may not know any better.
But they don't. The statistics show over and over again that they don't, and they haven't. Is this a problem a solution rather, looking for a problem?
Is it really?
I'm just asking.
If it's a real thing, if they believe that only American citizens are voting in U.S. elections, Major, then there shouldn't be a problem with this, because you're just confirming what's already happening if you believe that. But instead, they're saying it's a poison pill, and they're saying, even though it's already the case, they're not in favor of it. Doesn't make any sense. You can't have it both ways.
Last week, former President Trump said he lost the 2020 election by a whisker, conceding something he had refused to concede for almost 4 years. Can we now as a nation put to rest the lie about the 2020 election, that it was stolen from former President Trump?
Major, we should be talking about the issues right now that matter to people in this country, about the inflation that's killing middle class in this country, about the open border, southern border, that's not only contributing to all kinds of people who we don't even know what their background is coming across our borders, but fentanyl overdoses in all these small towns across the country. And we should be talking about what peace and stability around the globe looked like under the last administration. That's what we should be talking about. And that, frankly, is going to be the topic tomorrow night in Philadelphia.
When I was in Milwaukee, there was a degree of confidence I'd never encountered before at a Republican convention, talking about expanding the map, Virginia, New Hampshire, Minnesota. Would you say Minnesota is up for grabs still, or has the election shifted away and better for Trump to focus elsewhere?
Well, when it comes to Minnesota, look, the policies of Kamala Harris and Donald Trump are going to determine the presidency. Donald Trump has already showed what an America First policy looks like. I would argue that over the last 3.5 years, Kamala Harris has showed us what an America Last strategy looks like. The only difference, by putting Tim Walz on the ticket, you may have put Minnesota in play. I don't know if you noticed last week, but before Tim Walz was named as her running mate, Kamala Harris enjoyed a 10-point advantage, much different from Joe Biden and Trump head up. Once she was anointed and was recreated, she had a 10-point lead, and she put Tim Walz on the ticket, and she lost 5 of those right away. So he's not a very popular guy at home. And
would you suggest to the Trump campaign that Minnesota is in play and it ought to put resources into Minnesota?
I think you got to be looking everywhere for votes. Period.
One other thing. For former President Trump to say over the weekend that he will win without a single vote being cast, mail-out ballots haven't even gone out, and that he will prosecute people or wants to prosecute people who are in position of election administration or donors to Kamala Harris, what does that tell you?
I think he is going to win, and I think he's...
But that's a think, not a will.
No, I think it's pretty easy to look at what this election's all about. On the one side, you've got double-digit inflation like we haven't seen in 40 years. People like to say that, oh, inflation is coming down. Major, People in my neck of the woods and all across this country go into the grocery store every week. They see how much they're paying for things. On average, $1,200 more a month than they were paying for the same basket of goods just 3.5 years ago. The gas tank, the crime, the open border, the instability all around the globe, whether it's Ukraine or Israel or other places. It's pretty clear the damage that has been done over the last 3.5 years. And I think the only candidate who will be on the stage tomorrow night that has shown how you rebuild an economy, that's shown how you seal the southern border, that's actually shown how you can maintain peace and stability around the globe, Donald Trump. It's a pretty easy choice.
Tom Emmer, thanks for your time.
Thank you.
Letting freedom ring, perhaps, how House Democrats are making the inalienable right the focus of their re-election bids. That's next. You're streaming America Decides. Welcome back to America Decides. In more ways than one, Beyonce's hit song Freedom has kind of become the unofficial anthem for Kamala Harris's presidential campaign now. In a memo reviewed by CBS News, the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee is urging an emphasis on freedom in close House races. I want to bring in our Scott McFarland. Scott, walk us through your new reporting on this.
Yeah, CBS News got a hold of this new memo from the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee in which they're urging their own members and their campaign advisors to adopt this freedom message in their campaign platform and their campaign messaging. Obviously, that would kind of coincide with what Vice President Harris is saying, but they also take this interpretation of the word freedom that they think can be mechanized effectively in their campaigns to expand freedom to not just protection of democracy, but women's reproductive rights, to issues countering Project 2025, which they argue may be encroaching too much on the executive branch and its freedoms. But also, I think it's indicative of the different complexion politically of these House races versus other battleground state races, because so many of these competitive House races are in states that are more traditionally blue. New York has a half dozen competitive races. California has at least a half dozen competitive races. From the House Democrats' campaign strategy, they think that type of messaging is effectively, or especially effective in states like that.
So those of us old enough to remember and who've read a few history books remember FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, talk about the four freedoms. Is this a kind of 21st century echo of that kind of either messaging or emphasis?
I think it's good campaign messaging to have that type of word associated with whatever argument you're trying to make, whether it fits like a glove or not. One of the more interesting conversations I had today was with the Democratic challenger in the Pennsylvania 10th Congressional District. This is a Democratic challenger against Scott Perry, the multi-term Republican from South Central Pennsylvania. And I asked her about this idea of freedom, and she immediately segued from talking about democracy in January 6th to women's reproductive rights, almost synthesizing those two somewhat different issues beneath the same heading. So to a degree, it's branding, but the House Democrats are urging their own members to adopt this, thinking it to be efficacious.
What's the economic tie-in?
First of all, there's a tie-in about having the freedom to make your own decisions with your own money. I mean, they can make the argument that that goes into tax policies. Where are we giving our tax cuts? Where are we shifting our tax policies? Again, that fits under the branding concept. But you can see a history of Democrats doing this. Let me take you back to 2022. In that special election in August 2022, the first federal election after the Dobbs decision, the Democratic challenger used the words freedom and transitioned to abortion rights, women's reproductive rights, utilizing it for the first time. And the Democrats overachieved in that special election and won it in upstate New York.
Scott, you know Republicans would tell you, hey, we own freedom. We've owned freedom for decades. Democrats can't encroach there. They got no purchase.
And the Republicans, with their emphatic response to our reporting, said Americans are looking for freedom from Vice President Harris's history of policies. You can see how it's adopted and mechanized by both parties. But this is as much about campaign lingo, campaign jargon, campaign messaging, as it is about the platforms, because these two parties in so many of these battleground states have already spent a lot of money and a lot of airtime explaining their platforms.
And there's an Afghanistan report worth noting?
Yeah, this is
quite separate from our conversation about this DCCC memo.
Long awaited, multiple years from House Republicans in their investigation of the tragedies in 2021 at Abbey Gate in Afghanistan. It's about 350 pages. The cover shot shows President Biden, but there are 285 references in this report to the, quote, Biden-Harris administration and what they did, clearly trying to connect Vice President Harris to all their findings. A few top lines of the report. They say that the Biden administration let that U.S. embassy stay too large for too long, leaving those there vulnerable in the case of an attack and for the collapse of the Afghan government. They also criticized them for leaving the Abbey Gate open for those seeking to get refuge, but leaving members vulnerable for attack. They also criticized the Biden administration for leaving weaponry by the billions and equipment by the billions in Afghanistan. Democrats respond, Major, saying that it was the Trump administration that put this date on the calendar in the first place and drew down U.S. military prematurely, too quickly, leaving all this vulnerable. This is what happens when you put this kind of report out between Labor Day and Election Day. You leave it prone to weaponizing for campaigns.
Scott MacFarlane, I am going to do you a favor. You didn't even ask. I'm going to relieve you of the curiosity you might have about election forecasts. Here's my advice and my gift. Ignore them. They have no mathematical or predictive value whatsoever. They are less reliable, in fact, than the least reliable weather forecast. Now, we do not do election forecasts here. Other news organizations do. I'm not here to fault their motives or their methods, because we have sort of come to believe that data and correct assumptions about that data can guide us to answers we most crave. And who doesn't crave the answer to the question, who's going to win? The problem with election forecasts is there simply isn't enough data. A recent article in Politico by Justin Grimmer, a professor of public policy at Stanford, argued that projections we use in other walks of life, say the future of stock prices, the aforementioned weather, or how to target advertising, rely, statistically speaking, on millions upon millions of observations of behavior, often collected on a near continuous basis. This allows for predictive confidence. That is not how presidential elections work. If I asked you, I bet you could not tell me how many presidential elections we have had. This will be America's 60th. As we know, we have one presidential election every 4 years. 60 is simply not a large enough data set. It's even more fragile when measured the passage of time of 4 years. Now, lots of behavior variations can leak into predictions based on data sets that are that small over that elongated sequence of time. Professor Grimmer argues, for accuracy's sake, it would take at least 28 more years of presidential elections, or brace yourself, up to 2,588 years more of presidential elections to create a data set large enough to give us true confidence in any predictive model. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't have 28 years to wait, or 2,588 years. Yeesh. So no disrespect to those who build such models, and no disrespect to those who have put some stock in them. I'm just trying to save you some time, some energy, maybe some emotional bandwidth. Election forecasts beguile, but do not reveal. They entrance, but do not explain. They dazzle, but do not determine. Leave them, at least until election year 4612. That does it for today. We'll be back with another edition of America Decides tomorrow at 5 p.m. Eastern. The Daily Report with John Dickerson starts right now.